Hello. Hello and welcome to the Columbus Metropolitan Club. I'm Steve Marks, a member of CMC's Board of Trustees and president of Hannah News Service here in Columbus. It's great to see you all here today. We are live streamed today thanks to our live stream partners, the Columbus Dispatch, PNC, and NBC4i. We'd also like to thank those of you who purchased a virtual seat for today's forum. We're very grateful for this support and are able to continue live streaming in large part because of you. Thank you. Today's forum, Policing in the Community, Does the Past Dictate the Future?, is brought to us with support from Crabb, Brown, James. Won't you please help me thank them? If you are young or new to Columbus, you might not be aware that the Columbus Police Department and Columbus City Hall have had a long history together, some of it healthy, some not so much. There have been divisions and disagreements over policy and procedure over the years. We hope discussing the history will shed some light on the current state of affairs and provide a pathway to progress. Let's welcome our experts. Larry James, Managing Partner, Crabb, Brown, and James. Michael Curtin, former journalist. And our host, Colleen Marshall, co-anchor at WCMH NBC4. Colleen, the stage is yours.
Thank you. They can't call you a former journalist. You're always a journalist, aren't you? That doesn't go away when I retire, does it?
Thank you.
Welcome to both of you. And as Steve mentioned, we are in some troubling times right now. Not only are we in the midst of a pandemic, but we have seen citizen activism at a higher level than I think we've seen maybe since the 60s. And we've seen it on a united front across the country. And we are seeing here in Columbus, in the midst of all of this, what appears to be a division between the administration and the men and women who wear blue. A troubling division, a lot of finger pointing, and a lot of anger. And so I think we should point out that Larry James is the National Counsel for the Fraternal Order of Police, who has quite a bit of history in this. And so I'm going to ask you the first question. As you look at this division and all the finger pointing, which direction do you think the fingers should be pointed?
Well, let me just give you a little bit of background myself. I was safety director in Columbus in addition to being general counsel to the National Fraternal Order of Police since '01. In my early days in Cleveland, Ohio, I worked for the law department, second and third year, assigned the police department, moved to Columbus, worked in the city attorney's office, assigned the safety department under Bernie Chupka. I investigated with IA, I prosecuted for internal affairs officers, I worked with Vice. So that's my history as I look at this. And I think a little bit of history is in order as to what the FOP or unions do or do not do. This state is a state that recognized collective bargaining. Before collective bargaining, public employees such as the FOP, what they called it collective begging. Before and after, the FOP unions do not hire, they do not fire, they do not set the criteria for hiring police officers, they do not discipline, they do not promote, they do not train, they do not select the chief, they do not set the budget, they do not purchase equipment or make the decisions about equipment or budget. So the issue for me with that backdrop, having a 360, I think there's a lot of misinformation, because as I look around the country, not just in Columbus, Ohio, you ask yourself, how did law enforcement become the enemy of the people? That just doesn't make any sense to me, because as I laid out, management makes all the decisions that matter. They control all the things that matter. The other issue that seems to be a misnomer is people talk about, reform or qualified immunity. And I said, I'm sorry, I don't know what you're talking about. Qualified immunity doesn't mean that an officer can't be terminated, fired, disciplined, prosecuted, any of those things. It relates to a narrow issue about civil liability. And that civil liability and immunity goes to all public officials, not just public safety officers. And the last thing I'll say is, there's this commentary about arbitrations. When you look at the history of arbitrations in America, mandatory arbitration, 2% of disciplinary cases actually go to arbitration. When you break that number down, that 2%, it comes out to about 48% that management wins. And the reason the few times that labor actually wins in arbitration, there's a procedural problem normally. So for instance, if 10 officers have been disciplined for the same infraction, 7 of them have been given 10 days, 1 of them has been given 20 days, and the other officer is terminated. So when that comes to an arbitrator, they'll say there it's discriminatory or misapplication of the contract terms or discipline. So I'm a little bit confused as to how law enforcement became the enemy, and it's hard for me to sit from my many hats that I've worn over the years to say that law enforcement is the enemy.
And Mike, I'm going to go to you with some of the look here in Columbus, as we say, how did they become the enemy? I think if we look back in the city of Columbus, there have been instances where there was an absolute appearance that there was an abuse of authority or an abuse of power by police. And there were claims of discrimination going back decades. So from your perspective, and you were at the Dispatch for decades, and I know you're a student of history, how did we get to the point now where police are viewed as, Larry said, the enemy?
I think, Colleen, that's a misnomer. If you do a content analysis of Mayor Ginther's comments from start to finish during this so-called controversy, he's gone out of his way to praise the police department. He's gone out of his way to condemn the leadership of the FOP. He's gone out of his way to say he's talking about the FOP, not the police department. And if you look at the history of the FOP, about 10%, and that's generous, about 10% of the sworn officers in the Division of Police actually take part in FOP activities, such as endorsement votes and so forth. But it is the acknowledged bargaining unit of the department, and so the FOP gets the attention, gets the flack, if you will. Janet Jackson's report, the group that she chaired, the Matrix report, went out of their way to praise the police department, to say we've got one of the best police departments in the country, but we need to improve. I do appreciate the asking about historical perspective, because I've tried to, over my career as a journalist, take current issues and put them in historical perspective. And I'll kind of segue off what Larry was saying with a little bit different slant on that. When we do study history, and we study the history of the FOP, it's important to acknowledge the FOP began in 1935 here locally, but for the first 50 years they did, as Larry mentioned, they engaged in collective begging and not bargaining, because Ohio didn't have an effective collective bargaining law for public employees until 1984. It was enacted in '83. It took effect April 1 of all dates, April Fool's Day of 1984. And that's when the current state collective bargaining law took effect, and it was a transformative event. And it was then and is now one of the most labor-friendly, liberal collective bargaining laws in the country, bar none. Why was it so liberal? Because in '83, '84, Democrats took power of the governor's office in both branches of the legislature for the first time in a quarter century, for the first time since the Mike DeSalle days of '59-'60. And there was all this pent-up demand. The public sector grew tremendously from the '50s to the '80s. Local governments grew tremendously, state governments grew tremendously, and so public employee unions grew commensurate with that growth. There was all this pent-up demand to have a modern collective bargaining law to replace the old Ferguson Act of '48, which was very punitive. And the Democrats delivered for one of their key core constituency groups. So we got what we got. There was not one Republican vote in the legislature for that bill. It was passed with all Democratic votes. And it made just about everything, quote, all matters pertaining to wages, hours, or terms, or other conditions of employment, et cetera, subject to collective bargaining. The FOP then and now will say anything you try to do is subject to collective bargaining, whether it's so-called management right or not. And most importantly, for unions representing the public safety forces, police and fire, it requires binding arbitration for the settlement of all economic and non-economic impasses between cities and the unions representing safety forces. What does that mean in practice? It means that when both sides cannot agree on wages, benefits, or even disciplinary actions, such as firing a police officer, the buck ultimately does not stop with the police chief. It doesn't stop with the safety director. It doesn't stop with the mayor. It doesn't stop with the city council. It stops with an arbitrator, an unelected, nameless, faceless arbitrator sent by the State Employment Relations Board to make the key decisions. Management rights are farmed out in Ohio. When the two sides can't agree, it's farmed out to one arbitrator. That's where the buck stops. And the FOP, as the bargaining agent for the Division of Police, has understood how to fully utilize the power the state's collective bargaining law gives it. The FOP historically has been the most aggressive of the city's three major labor unions. I hand it to them. They know how to use that law. They use it very effectively. They're very hard-nosed about it. And if you look at what's going on right now, the mayor is at war with the leadership of the FOP, not with the police department.
And let's talk about that for a minute, because we have seen the mayor very effectively stand up at news conferences and say, it's time for a citizen review board, it's time for change, and point the finger and say the FOP will not cooperate. I spoke to the president of the FOP, who says we've never had the chance to cooperate because the mayor has never talked to us. So here we have these two units in the midst of what I think we could have termed a crisis situation that was going on the streets of Columbus. The two people who are responsible for at least how everything rolls out, the FOP head and the head of the city, don't talk to each other. So
Well,
who's
that's just proven
at
by
fault
a story
here?
2 weeks ago in the Dispatch. They did meet, and the meeting did not go well, but they certainly met, and there have been talks, but they've not been the kind of talks that the two sides are looking to, find. And part of this, in my view, is posturing. It's not a good word, but it's posturing for the upcoming negotiations. The existing FOP contract expires December 8th, so they're in the run-up to negotiations for a new contract, probably a 3-year contract. And, the court of public opinion is very important to both sides. And both sides, witness the billboards the FOP's taken out. Why do you do that? They're lobbying to gain advantage in the court of public opinion. The mayor's doing it and the FOP's doing it.
Well, you mentioned that meeting. It was less than an hour, and they say they aren't really being heard. So I'll ask you, Larry, I'm sure, let's go back to Larry on this. What is the position of the FOP? They claim that they are not being consulted, that they deserve a seat at the table. From your perspective, do they deserve a seat at the table for all of this?
Let me come at it a different way, because as safety director and having been advisor to Mayor Reinhardt before taking the position as safety director, and what has happened before here, because the last time we have seen this type of friction was when Mayor Reinhardt appointed Chief Jackson. And the FOP at that time basically objected to the appointment. They showed up and they somewhat showed out. So I got a call from Dr. Booth and Bishop Clark as the new incoming safety director and said, what is your plans? Are you going to side with the FOP or are you going to side with the chief? I said, I'm not going to side with either. But here's what I will tell you both. This issue will cease. And if it doesn't cease, hold me responsible for it. This is not going to be a situation where we're going to throw bombs at each other, because it's not good for our citizens. It's not good for law enforcement. It's not good for building confidence with our citizens, particularly our black community, if you're going to say that this is somehow a racial issue. Because if, like we're seeing with election now, if you begin to say that there are all these faults with the system, then there is no confidence in it. So what I did is I called the FOP in and I said, look, folks, here's the way this thing's going to go. We're going to cut out this bannering back and forth. This is our chief. He's going to be our chief. Let's talk about what our needs are. And so as we moved into these policy issues, and for those who were around, Chief Jackson had a difficult start. There were a number of policies I reversed of the chief that I thought were not reasonable, not right. The idea of eating in the district, going to the bathroom in the district, I reversed those. So within about 2 months, we had a working understanding, and at that time, the leadership of the FOP was Larry Deck. And there were some things we wanted to achieve. We wanted to increase minority recruitment. I called the FOP in. I said, I need your support on this. We created a budget of $300,000. We went to Roger Blackwell at the OSU, Fisher College, and we brought in the leadership of the fire department, and we brought in the leadership of the police department, and we began to move that 15% up. So under the Reinhardt administration, we began to see that increase in minority recruitment. The editorial in this morning's Dispatch talked about that. The Linden area, which had been a crime area at that time, we needed to take back that area of the city. We were seeing the same things then that we are seeing now. I called in Deputy Chief Rutter. I said, look, I need to saturate Linden with police officers. I don't care if they're on foot or they're on bikes, but we need to do this. And he said, that's a bad idea. And I said, why is it a bad idea? He says, we're not welcome in that community. I said, what do you need to be welcome in that community? We need to be invited in. So I had dinner at our house with Brother Donnell Muhammad, who was the leader of the Nation of Islam. And I said, Brother Donnell, I need you to hold a press conference. I need you to invite the police in. I need you to work with them, and I need you to help them. And I need you to send that message out. That's exactly what we did, and that's how ACE got created. Commander Rod, we were having problems in OSU bike area. I called Commander Rod in. I said, okay, you have this area. And he said, Director, what are you trying to achieve? I said, we're trying to make sure that police has a presence, that the students are not in harm's way. And he said, when would you like to implement that? I said, can we get it done in the next month? He said, I'll tell you what, we'll get it done in the next 2 weeks. Here's what I need from you. I need the idea of starting early, ending early, or doing whatever necessary. Don't put my people on a time clock. That idea of working together. And the one thing we did with the recruitment policy at OSU, you may recall, I'm probably one of the few people that has actually fired a chief. I fired the fire chief because he was not committed to the program of minority recruitment. That's how Herman Duco became fire chief at that time. So to answer your question, that's the way friction should work. My idea as safety director, I said to the leadership in police and fire, you walk in that door, if you want to cuss me out, you want to call me names, we want to argue, let's do it. But when we leave this room, we're going to be in agreement because the citizens need to be served. And I think that's what needs to happen.
There have been a lot of fights over the years between mayors and the FOP. It's just that they're more visible now. You know, until 2017, we'd never had the FOP take out billboards criticizing the sitting mayor before. That's new. But let me give you a couple examples of pretty good fights we had under Mayor Coleman. In 01, Mayor Coleman's second year in office, there were a lot of complaints about disparate stops, you know, racial profiling, cops stopping minorities for, you know, minor things, taillights out, you know, where they weren't doing that in white neighborhoods. So Mayor Coleman attempted to put a program in place to require the record keeping of minor stops, all sorts of things, so that the city can start building a database to examine that question. The FOP went to court. They said, you can't do that without bargaining with us to do it. They went to court. They got a temporary restraining order from Judge Dave Kane at the time, stopped the mayor in his tracks from doing it, frustrated Mayor Coleman to no end that he couldn't even do that without bargaining for it. But it's, you know, and I give the FOP credit. They used the full extent of that law that Ohio has on the books. It's a very labor-friendly law. It requires administrations to toe the line. It gives the unions equal power with management, and they use it. Another example, a little more, I don't want to use the word brazen, a little more ballsy, perhaps on the part of the FOP, 09, at the tail end of the Great Recession. You remember the Great Recession, 07, 08, 09? The city was tanking. The city was running a deficit. You can't run deficits in this state. Unlike the federal government, you got to make the books balance. The mayor was looking at a projected deficit in the tens of millions of dollars. He laid off 300 workers. He closed recreation centers, and he asked all three major unions, asked me firefighters, FOP, to take a pay freeze for the rest of the year to get the city through the year. Firefighters said, yep. AFSCME said, yep. The FOP promptly filed an unfair labor practice saying you can't do that without bargaining with us. They're aggressive, they're hard-nosed, and a lot of these fights have taken place without a lot of headlines in the past. Today, for whatever reason, combination of reasons, personalities, perhaps Mayor Ginther isn't the natural politician, I don't think he is, that Mike Coleman was. You know, the FOP takes out the billboard in 2017 after the firing of Officer Zach Rosen, saying we have no confidence in Mayor Ginther, we have no confidence in Safety Director Pettis, we got no confidence in then Council President Zach Klein, and we're off to the races.
Let me respond to that, because I think one of the issues that occurred in our administration, mace was not classified as a use of force. And I called the FOP and I said, look, we have a problem. We need to address this issue. And I don't want to argue about it, fight over, but let's do this. Let's begin to determine how to classify that as a use of force and then trigger an in-service training for those officers that had X number of use of force incidents. And we agreed to it. I mean, I did not have one arbitration under our 10-year, and I don't know, my experience was just very different, because my first, what you call me is one thing, what I answer to enough. This ego stuff is just crazy. It has no place when things are this critical. So if you're thin-skinned on either side, you need to get over it. Because I think these issues are all issues that have been dealt with before, have been handled before, and maybe it's just two personalities that on a collision course at the same time. I just don't see the FOP around the country. There are some incidences where Chicago's a little bit different. But here in Columbus over the years, we pretty much had a good working relationship, have been able to work through those things. And then I'll come back to arbitration aside, 2% of those disputes go to final arbitration. The option to that is to throw it in litigation. You're going to quadruple the cost. It's going to take a lot longer, and I definitely do not think that's the best way to go.
You know, I have to ask you, though, you mentioned egos, and you talked about the fighting between the mayor. I had an off-the-record conversation with a local political leader who said to me, none of the Democrats even bothered to go meet with the FOP to seek endorsements during this election cycle because they know the FOP won't be endorsing Democrats. And so we're not going to bother to talk to them. So we just don't talk to them. And it's like, okay, we as citizens don't care whether or not you're seeking the endorsement. We as citizens should care whether or not you are willing to communicate with each other. And what I see happening here is neither side is willing to communicate with each other, but they're sure ready to get in front of the cameras and tell us what they think about the other person. And so you've mentioned a lot of what you did behind closed doors, how you pulled the sides together. Are you saying they are failing to do that currently?
Yes.
And who needs to step up? Who needs to open that door and invite the parties in?
I think when we look historically, particularly at elected leadership, that's where it should start. I mean, look, the one thing I knew as safety director, the rank and file, and these folks were going to be here when politicians have come and gone. I think the critical assets for me, particularly as a black man, looking at the issues of crime, and when I looked at the need that certain zip code areas needed, I knew we had to find peace. Because if we didn't find peace, our community was going to suffer. I mean, we have strong advocates out there who are trying to bridge the gap between this high crime that's taken place and the police officer. One of the initiatives we have going around the country is Faith in Blue, where we use our clergy. We're doing that in Indianapolis. We're doing that in Baltimore. We're trying to get that done in Atlanta. So you figure out what vehicle you need to bridge this communication in this big divide. That's what we should expect from our elected officials and our police department.
And Mike, I'll ask you from the historic perspective, he touched on the fact that, race is an issue, might be an issue in some of what we're seeing. There were lawsuits filed on behalf of women and on behalf of minorities in the early 80s to force the police department to diversify. How much of the historical underpinnings of all of that are we still feeling right now? And how is that going to impact these relationships and what we're seeing image-wise, the people who want to be police officers in the future?
Well, in the 70s and 80s, Columbus was under a federal court order to hire one black officer for every white officer until they got the numbers up because they were so dismally low, and that complaints just prompted that federal court order. Over time, the city did a good job of getting the numbers up, and at the end of the 80s, they met the target of 15%, 14.9% minority, and Judge Holshoe at that point lifted the federal order. It's been declining pretty much ever since. It's down to 10% now. There's lots of reasons for that. I don't pretend to have all the answers, but the committee that Janet Jackson headed, as well as the Matrix report, lays out a lot of innovative proposals for getting those numbers up, working more aggressively with the community colleges, working more aggressively to perhaps even award bonuses to people who refer promising young people into police roles, all sorts of things. But I mean, Larry's a spokesperson for the FOP. He would know better than I, but I'm assuming there's still a meaningful stigma attached to police work among a lot of young African Americans, and it takes yeoman's work to overcome that, to get the numbers to where we need them to be.
And certainly in the current environment, we can't ignore what's been going on around the country. Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, it's changing the image of the police. And Larry, we've been doing a show called The Confrontation, where we sit down and talk about race. And Matt Barnes, who might be the sweetest young guy I've ever met, told us a story about being racially profiled as a teenager because he was driving through Bexley. And he was pulled over, and they accused him of going 26 and a 25, and they harassed him. And so when you hear those stories, you have to understand why minorities might be reluctant. And, I'm telling you, I'm sure you have your own perspective on this, but you have to see why minorities might be reluctant to put on that uniform.
It's a bigger issue. You're seeing larger segments of law enforcement retire early. You're seeing few of applications. I think applications are down almost 60% around the country for law enforcement, whether that's black or white. In Baltimore and Houston and Chicago, you have a larger presence of black and minority officers. But here's the problem we're having if this dialogue continues, and whether you try to departmentalize and say it's the FOP leadership versus the rank and file, officers do not make those distinctions. So what we have to be careful of is we don't send this super chilling effect on applicants who would otherwise want to join the force and will not, because those numbers are shrinking. This new generation do not stay in the same job the same amount of time as our generation. You're looking at a 20% increase, early increase of retirement. You're not able to find the bodies. So what's going to happen, the standards are going to be lowered to get warm bodies. And I tell people, I did this to the Federalist Society, I said to them, be careful what you wish for, because you're going to have a department that's the criteria of admissions is going to be lower, and you're going to constantly lose those senior experienced officers. I think Columbus has one of the best police departments in the country. And I look around, and we are the poster child in many jurisdictions. And all you have to do is go around and canvass the other departments. So I would say that clearly we need to figure out how we're going to bridge this diatribe and these accusations back and forth, because that's not what leadership does.
Another important point, and this is a point that offers hope because it unites the left and the right. You can find seminars on the Charles Koch Foundation website and seminars on the left, from left foundations. And what almost everybody agrees on, including working police, is that we need to see a new model develop for 21st century policing. The stats show us that roughly half of all the runs that police go on in this city and in almost all cities have one way or another something to do with substance abuse and or mental health. And do we always have to have a uniformed officer who's trying to enforce the law go on those runs to take care of these mental health issues and these substance abuse issues? And the answer is maybe. Our police departments of the future are going to look differently than they look today. We're going to have a blended, I think, force of people who are not just people who are out there enforcing the law, but who are out there trying to build community, trying to stop problems before they become too severe, getting people the services they need, get them plugged in to Adam H., get them plugged into these mental health service providers and others, because you can't police your way out of the problems we have in our big cities in the way we've traditionally understood law enforcement. And I think that unites people across the spectrum.
I think you're probably right. I think police officers would play devil's advocate and say, when you get that call, you don't know what's on the other end. Yeah. And that's why sometimes, do you roll the dice and say, we don't need someone in uniform to roll up? Breonna Taylor, they didn't realize the people at the door were police officers. So I'll turn this over to you, Larry. What would be the FOP reaction to this new model? And I think new models are on the way, but what will the FOP say to all of that?
I think they will embrace it. So some of the things we do right now, I was here at the Metropolitan Club when we were talking about body cameras, and if you go back and you look at that, and I said, look, body cams are here to stay. We created a model policy for body cams that we utilize around the country. We have training comes up. Every March, I put together a leadership training for law enforcement, and I put another leadership training for lawyers who represent. We deal with de-escalation. We deal with reform. We talk about these issues about health care and training. When I was on a Zoom here locally with the Urban League, and I had a couple school board members ask, why do we have law enforcement police officers in your school? Well, you contracted for them. If you believe you need a certain skill set in your school other than law enforcement for disciplinary person, train them, contract for them, and do it. Law enforcement, I wish you could be a part of the amount of money that we spend on part of the FOP in the leading areas of training. And I learned early on as safety director, if I went down to my command staff and I said, here are the problems, here's the issues we're dealing with, they would say, Director, tell me what you're trying to achieve and let us help you get there. But you got to ask the question, you got to listen. And our leadership, I think, are there. They got there. They were a little bit slow on body cams, but they will, they love them. They live by them. I think the culture is changing. We've drafted a policy that will go out to all members so they understand what civilian review boards are, what they're about. We've done the same thing to educate them about arbitrations, collective bargaining, what occurs around the country and what does not. And all these issues that you're talking about, I could show you our blueprint of what we're doing, and we're trying to lead in those areas.
Well, to that point, and Colleen, you covered this 2 weeks ago when former Chief Jacobs, former Chief Distelzwag, and former Deputy Chief Rockwell had that press availability. And Rockwell was asked specifically, what's your position on a civilian review board? And he paused and he said, well, I'm okay with it if the members of that board are trained to sufficiently understand the training, the protocols, the procedures. You can't have a civilian review board made up of a bunch of amateurs. These people have to be steeped in the same type of training that police officers get so they can make informed judgments. And if, I think there's potential there, quite frankly. I tend to be a glass half full person more than empty, but I think once we get past some of this heated rhetoric between the FOP leadership and the mayor, there's common ground to be had about the civilian review board, because it's coming. We're going to have one in the city before long, and the question is that board capable and competent of doing the job? If it is, the police force will embrace it.
Yeah, we haven't recommended on that. We've just created a model that our members can look at. Look, we have 150-plus cities with civilian review boards, including Minneapolis, a budget of $1 million, Chicago, a budget of $13 million, New York, a budget of $16 million. Tell me one that works. And I think the thing I would say as a former safety director, let's listen, let's study the problem, and let's try to get it right for once if we're going to go that place.
I missed my mark. I was supposed to remind people 3 minutes ago that we will be taking audience questions, and that Jane will also have some questions, I believe, that we're getting virtually from our audience that's watching online. So that's coming up in a couple minutes. But let's talk briefly about that Civilian Review Board. Voters will be voting on it in November. We still don't know what it is. They put it on the ballot without telling us what the parameters are. Who's in charge? Do they have subpoena power? Who's going to make the makeup of the board? What kind of disciplinary authority will they have? Will they be making recommendations, or will they take direct action? Do you think voters should be comfortable voting for a Civilian Review Board when those questions are not answered?
It's like a lot of state constitutional amendments you vote for. You vote for a framework of something, and then the details are filled in by a statute later on. It's not uncommon for a charter amendment or a state constitutional amendment to lay out a framework for the voters to adopt and not to get into a laundry list of detail. The police and others have legitimate questions about reserving judgment on this thing until they can see some of that detail. But you're right, the voters of Columbus will be voting on this proposed review board without the detail about how many members, what kind of backgrounds those members have to have.
What kind of knowledge they need to have?
What kind of training will be required for them to take a seat on that review board. So that's all legitimate. But if I can make one other point about cops being among the people who want the bad cops weeded out as much as anybody. There was a fascinating poll just released recently by the Pew Research Center, and the Pew Research Center, by my books, does the best polling reporting in the country. They just released a survey of 7,917 police officers from departments with at least 100 officers or more, so medium-sized cities and up. It was conducted by the National Police Research Platform, reported by Pew, and that survey among these 7,917 officers found that only 27% of respondents, basically a quarter of those police officers, felt their departments did a good job holding accountable officers who consistently do a poor job.
Wow.
Cops want the bad cops out.
And let me just echo that. Again, Larry Deck was the FOP leadership, and there were a couple disciplinary cases, I recall, that Larry came over to see me after I'd had a few decisions. He said, "Director, just do the right thing." And he would send the signal, and he'd say, "This one's worth saving. We don't take a position on this. If we have to, we'll make a statement." And, you know, I think as we have gotten into this 21st century issues, I think you're going to find a lot more of that. The response out of Minneapolis, without exception, was, "We don't do that." Those regulations were on the book in Minneapolis. That technique was trained in Minneapolis, and we thought it was horrible. So,
Yeah. All right, Jane, we're going to let you go and ask our, I'm assuming this is a virtual question coming up first?
We have some that came in online as people registered, and then we have some virtual questions as people
Okay.
are watching today. So I'm going to start with this one because it addresses exactly what you just talked about. Richard Needles from Protective People Strategies, LLC. If 99% of officers are good, that means 1% are not. CPD has 1,800 officers. I would expect that 18 a year would be fired. Over a 30-year period, there would be 540 terminations of, quote, bad cops. Do these numbers hold true? Have 450 officers been fired in the past 30 years? And if not, why not?
I couldn't speculate on that. I'd need a lot more information to look.
Somewhat
I can tell you that Chief
hypothetical.
Jacobs, in the news conference that Mike referenced, she talked about the fact that she herself had, over the course of her time as chief, I think she said fired, you listened to that, Mike, didn't she say 27 people A couple of them went to review, and the citizen reviewer, the arbitrator, overturned her decision. But there have been firings, and there were some that the arbitrator sided on the same side as the city's position. Hi, could you introduce yourself and tell us your question?
Sure, Colleen. Actually, you work with a former Panther that I went to Linden with in Charles.
With Carrie Charles?
Carrie Charles, absolutely. So, so Lamar Graham, graduate of Linden McKinley. And I just heard you say something, Mike, that something that's been a thought in my mind, and I wanted to publicly say what I'm thinking. And I heard you just say about 27% that you said bad cops or good cops want bad cops out. Or cops want...
27% of the surveyed officers thought that their department did a good job holding accountable those cops who are consistently bad performers.
Yes. I don't know what you all think about this. This is, I'm sure it's probably already proposed. I'm sure that it's already been in the books. This is nothing new that I'm sure that I'm thinking of. But my thoughts is, give us 5, we'll give you 5. Give us 5 bad cops that you know who are terrorizing community. And we'll give you 5 people from the community who are terrorizing the community.
Let me see if I can respond to it.
Sure.
Yeah, the role of the FOP is comparable to the role of the lawyer. There's a duty of fair representation. There's a legal duty that union members have to defend their members and make sure the system and due process works. If that system works, we're all satisfied. My first 3 cases of termination were 3 black officers on 3 shoddy investigations and recommendation of termination. I reversed the chief in every one of those. Once you go down that slippery slope of lessening the standard and not allowing due process to work, you compromise the system for everyone.
Can I make a point?
Sure.
To piggyback on that, I found an article in the Dispatch from June of 2018. They took a look of 10 years worth, a decade worth of FOP grievances. And it's important to note that in 38 cases in which a Columbus officer was fired, the FOP did not contest 75% of them.
Correct.
Okay. They did, to Larry's credit, I mean, his point is accurate. They are judicious about which cases they take in grieve and which ones they don't. 75% of the fire cops did not get support from the FOP to do a grievance. Of those that did, according to this June 2018 Dispatch article, of 9 firings, 6 were overturned, 3 were sustained. In 23 cases in which there was discipline short of a firing, in 17 of the 23 cases, or 74%, arbitrators issued rulings overturning the level of discipline that the division had imposed.
Okay, thanks. And your next question?
This is from County Commissioner Marilyn Brown. How do both sides get beyond where we are today to make progress for our residents?
Interesting question coming from someone who's in a position of leadership. So, Larry, let's hear your thoughts on that.
Mike knows when I go back to the days of Jerry Hammond and that kind of politics, and everyone knows that Buck and Jerry hated each other. I mean, they couldn't agree on the day of the week. But on the issues that counted, and I mean, there were sometimes Jerry wanted to go to fisticuffs with me over trying to move him a certain way. We got there. There was a commitment that at the end of the day, the ego was locked away, at least for that time period. The discussions took place and a solution was had.
Who has the non-compromising ego now?
I'll leave that for God.
Jane?
Kathy Fox wants to know, can you describe any positive national examples of police and community interaction programs that have been successful in reducing confrontational police handling of peaceful protests?
Until this recent uprising, Indianapolis had a great model. What Rick Snyder had done over there as president of the FOP, working with the black clergy, and then brought the entire faith-based community together and began to take out billboards, begin to have community meetings, the One Cop initiative, the Faith in Blue. We were having great success until this recent episode. In Atlanta, we are starting to do that again, but when all of this, after the George Floyd situation, everything was put on the back burner. Now, I was on a conference call the other night with the FOP leadership, and we put $25,000 to that initiative that we are going to, again, roll out nationally. We're putting together a working kit, and we will bring in our leadership to assist those community to put those initiatives together.
It's important to note, all the sparks can obscure the positive trajectory that we've been on for a long time. Complaints about Columbus Police have been on a downward trajectory for a decade. 10 years ago, there were 647 complaints against Columbus Police. Last year, there were 246. Those numbers have been coming down year by year by year by year. We've been on a very good trajectory in terms of how our police interact with our citizens.
Well, and I'll ask a question for myself. Are there programs where police officers have interaction with grade school children and middle school children, perhaps thinking of long-term recruitment to begin to help children understand the role of police and that develop relationships at really young ages?
I think one thing I've always said, it's about the staff, the number of staff, the lack of staff. Mike talked about, right now, we don't have community policing because the police officers are running from crisis to crisis. We look at the number of officers are going down. We look at the budget. It's expensive. Safety takes up 2/3 of the budget. The question then becomes, how do we reprioritize? So we agree on the reform on reprioritizing if it helps us better police. We used to have the DARE program. We used to have other programs, Hot Pursuit. Those things are all gone now.
Police Athletic League.
Yeah, they're all gone.
Perhaps retired police officers, or is there such a thing that they could get involved as volunteers?
I think that if we can quiet the noise, and leadership comes out, I think we can get there. I know I was in Kansas City a few years ago, and we were having this same discussion, and the political leadership began to make those kind of overtures in bridging those gaps.
Sir, we're going to let you ask the final question. We're almost out of time, so if you can introduce yourself.
My name's Bill Grindle. Mr. Curtin, Ms. Marshall, I guess my question is probably more posed towards you. Your point, Mike, that the numbers have been going down for 10 years. If we pay attention to what we see in the media, and I think there is such a divisive mood in our world right now, what can you do as journalists to help make sure that truth overrides? That story is not only told when there's a spark.
You want to hit that first, Colleen?
Yeah, well, I will tell you, the media gets a lot of criticism saying you only focus on the negative, If you watch a newscast, all the stories aren't negative. But they certainly get a lot of intense attention. And I had a news director who told me one time when we were talking about this criticism, if you're driving down the road and you get a flat tire, you pull over to the side of the road. Do you get out of your car and praise the 3 tires who are doing a good job, or do you pay attention to your problem? And I think that's kind of what we do. We pay attention to the problems, and quite honestly, social media, the availability of police body cameras, we can now see it. And when we see it, I think we have an obligation to show it to you.
Let me put in a pitch for my old employer, the Dispatch. I think they're making an attempt to do some stories like that. 2 weeks ago on the front page, they featured an officer whose beat is on the west side of Columbus, and it was all about him rescuing women from human trafficking. It was a hell of a story.
Yeah, it was a
And
great
when I
story.
saw it, I thought, boy, that's the kind of stuff they need to do more and more and more of. You know, find those officers who are doing that heroic, life-saving work and tell their stories.
And I just did a feature story on police officers who were working as resource officers in high school and also became coaches at those high schools. So we do try to, we do the positive stories. It's just they don't probably stick in your mind as much. And I think we're about done. We thank both of you for being with us. We could probably talk about this all day, but thank you so much for sharing your information, your expertise.
Great. I hope you enjoyed today's forum. Found a lot of historical information. I've been in Columbus since 1985, and I learned quite a bit today listening. So remember, if you like CMC, you can join right now at the columbusmetroclub.org and receive 2 months bonus membership. That is expiring soon, so take advantage of that. And don't miss next week's very special event, Black History 101 Mobile Museum, right here in the Boathouse. It's the first time this is in Columbus, so it's a great opportunity to catch it. Schedule your tour time. Don't miss the lunch and conversation at noon as well. Thanks to our sponsors today, Crab Brown James, our live stream partners, PNC, the Columbus Dispatch, and NBC4i, and to our online virtual seat patrons, thank you. A special thanks to our speakers, Larry James, Mike Curtin, and Colleen Marshall. Thank you. We hope to see you again soon, but until then, be well and be safe. Thanks.